Are the New Testament documents reliable? Have they been copied and changed so many times by scribes that they are essentially unrecognizable from the originals? Find out the answers from my guest, Dr. Craig A. Evans, up next on The Rick Altizer Show.
From Nashville, Tennessee, Music City, USA, and the home of hot chicken, it's The Rick Altizer Show. Sit back, buckle up. Rick will talk with the movers, shakers, and creators who put Christ in Christian entertainment. He's a man who's clear so the world can hear. Here's Rick Altizer.
Hey, thank you for joining me today. That was Bob Allen, and you are listening to The Rick Altizer Show on Bot Radio. My guest today is professor, author, speaker, and now he's starring in a movie, Dr. Craig Evans. So the movie we're talking about is a movie called Fragments of Truth. It's going to be a Fathom event, one night in theaters on April 24th, 2018. And I saw the movie just yesterday, and Craig really was excited about that. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you got involved with this movie?
Well, I suggested it actually to my friends at Faith Life Films a couple of years ago, and I was just troubled by the nonsense that's in the popular media. Some of the books, extreme claims, ideas that who knows what the New Testament writings originally said. Who knows if the Gospels have been copied correctly? Maybe there have been all kinds of changes and so forth. And of course, as a scholar, I know that's baloney. But I wanted to do something to speak to the general public. And that would include, of course, Christians who don't know the Bible very well or its history, and especially people outside the church who have questions about faith. They want to know what Jesus really said, what he taught, what he did, and so on. But then they hear this nonsense about, well, there have been corruptions in the Gospels, the text has been changed, who knows anymore what it originally meant, and so forth. And of course, I knew that wasn't true. I'm a scholar. This is what I do for a living. And so I suggested, why don't we take a film crew and go to half a dozen cities in Europe where the oldest Greek New Testament manuscripts exist. And your hearers need to know that that's what it was written in Greek in the first century, the entire New Testament, including the four Gospels. Why don't we go to the places where the oldest manuscripts are and talk to the experts, talk to the curators, the conservers, the people who care for these things and study them. Let's film them. Let's look at them. Let's hold them in our hands, talk about them, and bring out the truth, and then do something with that. Make a movie that people can go out and see and then go, oh, I get it. That's what's really going on. And they can get through all the fiction and all the nonsense and get to the truth. So that was the idea. The people at Faith Life Films said, hey, that is a good idea. Let's do it. And so we did it. It was a great experience. We interviewed 20 experts. We learned a ton. And I think what we have produced is entertaining, exciting, and very educational.
And, I was really struck by how well it was made. It really looked like you're watching something, I don't know, from just anywhere. It really, the quality was so good on it. And the locations you went to all over the world. How many different locations did you go to?
Well, I think it's about 6. There were 3 in England. Manchester up north, and then in the south of England, Cambridge and Oxford. And of course, those are just beautiful cities. Everybody's heard of Oxford and Cambridge. And of course, we were in Dublin, Ireland, itself a beautiful city. We flew to Geneva, Switzerland. I mean, that's breathtaking. And then we flew south down to Rome in Italy, and we filmed inside the Vatican City in the Apostolic Library. So we went to some of the best known, most iconic places in the world, and that's where the oldest manuscripts are kept. And of course, the camera work, you allude to that. It's high tech. The movie is crisp, it's clear, it's like you're right there in the room with me looking at these manuscripts, and yet the technology is so advanced, it will be years before our video equipment, our projectors can actually present on the screen all of the information that's been captured. I just find that astounding. So this will never look old and grainy even years from now. And the other thing, too, you didn't mention, but John Rhys Davies, the well-known British actor who was in Indiana Jones and Lord of the Rings. He is the voice that narrates it, and he does a beautiful job. And now, in fact, I like the guy. He said he loved it. He found it interesting. He's done voice before, but he said he's never done one like this that was so interesting. So I now call him Lord of the Fragments.
I love it. Gimli. You got Gimli. You had Gimli there talking. It was great. He's got that great deep voice with that great accent. It was really, really nice. I really enjoyed it. So you're currently a professor at Houston Baptist University in Texas. You've been at multiple universities. You've authored and edited about 70 books. So you've been very involved in apologetics and in the gospel, and I know with the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things. How is making a movie? How did that differ from some of the other things you've done?
Well, the challenge is always you're faced with limitations. You can't get too technical. You can't blab on and on and on. So it's not like lecturing. It's certainly not like a book. And there's the printed text, and a person, if somebody doesn't understand what's been read, you can just reread it with lots of footnotes. When you do something like this, it's the audio visual thing. You have to cut to the chase. You have to be crisp, clear. You have to use language that the non-expert can understand. The non-expert in the audience might be brilliant, might be a brain surgeon, but doesn't know anything about this topic. And so you have to meet the audience where the audience is and just be real clear. And that's one of the challenges. And, we interview people. Typically, we interview them for an hour and a half. And, and we use 2 minutes, 3 minutes in the movie itself. And so you have to be selective. You really have to think about it. You have to make sure there's a flow so that the people watching it, the movie can follow it and be answering the question, oh, I get it. What's next? Oh, I understand. And answer the so what question. Like, what is this all about anyway? What's the payoff? And I think we do a good job of it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it again. Again, we're talking to Dr. Craig A. Evans, who is featured in the new film, Fragments of Truth. It's a Fathom event. It's going to be in theaters April 24th, 2018. Faith Life Films put it out, and you can get information about getting tickets to see this at fathomevents.com. And Fathom is spelled with an F, Fathom, events.com. And you can find a theater near you. And so I've emailed Bart Ehrman before. I've had communication with him. And Bart says, you can't trust the New Testament scriptures. They've been changed. The scribes have rewritten it to the point that you can't even believe any of it. It's been changed so much. I thought you really addressed that well in the film and showed how, is he being disingenuous?
Well, I have to be careful what I say in public. And I also, I would prefer that he's sitting right here next to me and we could look at each other while we talk about it. But there is a joke out and about, and that is there are two Bart Ehrmans. You were talking to the popular Bart Ehrman who says those kind of extreme things. Then there's the scholarly Bart Ehrman that goes to the Society of Biblical Literature meetings. He's a member of scholarly things, as I am, and he doesn't say it that way. In fact, why don't I let Bart Ehrman refute Bart Ehrman? If you go to the second edition of his Misquoting Jesus book that created a sensation when it came out in 2005, the paperback version came out a year or so later, and it had an appendix added to it at the back. And on page 252, so your listeners can go check it out, the middle of page 252, he addresses the question is his views really much different from Professor Bruce Metzger at Princeton, under whom Bart Ehrman studied? And Bruce was an evangelical scholar, lived to be 93. He trusted the text. He believed it was accurately preserved. And Bart Ehrman on page 252 in that appendix says that his view is not different from Professor Metzger's. And I think he just gave away the whole store when he did that. So Bart Ehrman, the scholar, won't say things like the text is so scrambled and messed up, we really don't know what was originally said. He would never say that among scholars because we would shout him down and laugh at him. But unfortunately, in popular settings, he will say extreme things. I wish he would not do that. It just isn't honest, because when it's all said and done, we in fact do believe that the text, the Greek text that we have today, is 99% or even higher than that in agreement with the original, and that what uncertainties remain, and they're very few and they're very minor, don't affect the meaning of the text at all, don't have any impact on Christian teaching, Christian theology in the least.
You know, he wrote a book with Bruce Metzger, The Text of the New Testament, which I don't know how popular that was. I don't see it in a lot of the bookstores. But I do see a lot of his books now, misquoting Jesus and why you can't trust the Bible and whatever, he's talking about. Do you have any idea how many books he sold?
Well, there'd be hundreds of thousands of copies of his several books by now. I don't know the exact count. I would think probably beyond 1 million copies altogether by this point. But those are popular books. Those are designed not for scholars. They're designed for non-experts. They read these things. They're confused. They're concerned. They're off-put. They don't know how to interact with it. What Bart is doing is he is correcting his own previous naive fundamentalism as a teenager when he became a Christian, and he grew up with that idea. And so the idea that scribes could make mistakes, which they do. All scribes make copyist errors and have to go back and correct them. I think that shook him up. And when there were a handful of passages where we just aren't real sure what the original reading was, that was out of step with his very naive understanding of what Scripture was supposed to be. And of course, there are other issues. He talks about it. He lost his faith because of problems in life and disappointments and unresolved issues about suffering in the world and that sort of thing. And I'm not being callous when I talk about that. I personally know him and regard him as a friend, and we're cordial toward one another. But I just wish he, wouldn't give in to this extreme in his popular books. But I'm sure the publisher encourages that because that's what sells books. But his scholarly books are not that way.
Yeah, and it's just interesting. I have the text of the New Testament that he wrote with Bruce Metzger. It's a different kind of book than the other things that he's written. But again, I think the other things have sold maybe 1,000 times more books. You're listening to the Rick Altizer Show on Bot Radio. My guest today is Dr. Craig Evans. We're talking about the movie Fragments of Truth that is going to be a Fathom event in theaters for one night only, April 24th, 2018. And you could find more information out about that film at Fathom, with an F, fathomevents.com. So if you could just help me kind of walk this through, because there were some really interesting things in the movie that really made it clear, because textual criticism can be complicated. It can get a little heady. And I thought the movie, with all the graphics and the 3D graphics you had, really helped bring it home. But if you could talk to me about, okay, let's say Paul writes 1 Corinthians. What happens to Paul's writing 1 Corinthians? What happens to that, what we call that autograph, that first document? Take it from there.
Well, in any letter that Paul writes, the first document that he makes a copy of it to retain. So when we talk about autographs, and that's a good word, it means the thing that's written in the hand of the actual author himself, and he retains it. So he sends one to the destination, and he retains one. He's done that with all of his letters. So we really are talking about two autographs, two originals anyway. And the chances of them being copied and copied many times, and thus the text being preserved, those chances go way up. And so the people who receive it, the Corinthians in this case, they get that letter and they treasure it. They're rebuked by it. They're instructed by it, but they keep it. They make copies of it. And it's possible that other Christian groups say, "Can we have a copy of it too?" And of course, Paul has retained a copy, and we have reason to believe that sometimes he would send copies of his own letters, he himself, to other Christian leaders and Christian groups. So this is how these manuscripts begin to multiply. And so by the time we get to the end of the first century, the apostolic age is over. The church is now a couple of generations old. There have been numerous copies made of these apostolic writings, and they've been disseminated widely. And that is what controls the text. So if somebody, for whatever reason, in a certain place decides he doesn't like the way Paul wrote it, or he doesn't like the way the Gospel of Matthew reads, and he decides to change it, well, that's not going to impact anything because the other 100 copies haven't been changed. And so that's why nobody can really get away with making alterations. That's why it's really nonsense to talk about the writings have all been altered, and so today we don't really know what they originally said. You'd have to have a coordinated effort, not just in Greek, but in early Latin translations. You'd have to have a coordinated effort in several cities, several regions. Who's going to orchestrate that? How in the world could somebody in the year 100 or 120 or whatever you want, any year you name, how can somebody coordinate a massive alteration so that the text is now different? Don't forget the originals are still floating around. We have reason to believe the originals were in existence, circulating, being read and copied for more than 100 years. So how in the world could you orchestrate a conspiracy like this and change the Bible, as it were, to make it read differently and then get away with that?
You know, we have such a throwaway society where we get books and we take them to Goodwill when we're done with them, and they don't have a long shelf life. But I would imagine 2,000 years ago, a writing from an apostle would be something that would be valued and treasured and probably would have a very long shelf life. And so they're keeping that original, as you said, and there's evidence to show that, and sometimes these originals were kept for more than 100 years?
Oh, yes, of course. And we have evidence from antiquity where people not talking about Christian literature, but talking about pagan literature, they talk about it 200, 300 years old. The autographs, the originals, they're treasured, they're kept. And of course, we have physical archaeological evidence where we find in a 5th century AD layer, we find a basket, believe it or not, still intact, a wicker basket full with 20 books, 20 writings, and they all date to the 2nd century. And so we realize, my goodness, these things are 300 years old before they were discarded, and they're still readable. They're still in pretty good condition. So we have physical evidence, archaeological evidence, literary evidence, as you say, that books were in circulation a long, long time. And we actually have 2 church fathers that talk about the autographs. One of them's name is Tertullian. He's in North Africa. He's writing in Latin. And in the year 190, he talks about 7 of Paul's letters in 5 locations, 5 different cities, and the autographs are still there. And he invites heretics and his skeptics that are dialoguing with him to go check them out. If you don't believe me, if you don't believe how Paul actually wrote his letter, what the original wording was, go check it out. It's actually there. And he actually mentions Romans, by the way. Go to Rome, and it's there. Another church father writing almost 100 years later, about 290 AD, he is talking about the original Gospel of John in Ephesus, still there, venerated by Christian people. So we actually have evidence that the autographs did last a long time. We have physical evidence, archaeological evidence, literary evidence, and direct church father testimony to that effect. And all of that would help stabilize the text and prevent it from being changed.
So when you say autograph, you're talking about the actual letter that Paul actually physically wrote and had written and delivered to Ephesus, delivered to Rome, delivered to the Corinth church. That document is still there in the church 100 years, 120 years, 150 years, and they're making copies off the original. So it's not a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's a copy off the original. And so by the time we're at 300 AD, okay, now we've got these copies out there, but most of them, would you say, are coming from 1 to 2 generations?
I don't know if it would be most of them, but there'd be a goodly number of them that would only be 2 generations or so removed from the originals. And just the fact that they are numerous ones, you can compare them. So along the way, scribes do make mistakes. They're almost always unintentional. Sometimes somebody might try to help the text or improve on it by making an intentional change, but it's an isolated occurrence. It's one guy. The other 500, the other 1,000 manuscripts don't have that mistake or that deliberate change. And that's how you can smoke out the mistakes and the changes, identify them and eliminate them and keep the text pure.
So if Paul in 1 Corinthians didn't really, when was 1 Corinthians written, 60 something?
No, earlier than that. We think 1st and 2nd Corinthians were probably written in 53 and 54 AD.
Okay. So we got 53 AD. We got 1 Corinthians 15, where he's talking about this creed that he got. For we know that Christ died, he rose, he appeared to the apostle, to Peter, then to James. Then Paul says, as a man born out of time appears to me. He says, oh, and if we're making this up, then we're just a bunch of liars, and we're of all men just to be pitied. So Paul's saying in 52, 53, Jesus physically rose from the dead, and we're not making it up. So if that wanted to be added, if he never said that, and let's say a scribe wanted to change that, and no, Jesus didn't, we don't really have Jesus raising from the dead till 200 AD. The way Bart Ehrman would make you want to believe that you didn't have this divine Jesus until it kind of evolved and crossing these people. This Christology kind of evolved over hundreds and 200s of years. How would you, in 52 AD, how would you get all of the 1 Corinthians all of a sudden to have that in there?
Well, it would be impossible. And in fact, on your timeline, when 1 Corinthians is written, if we are right, it's the year 53. That's only about 20 years after the Easter event itself. And Paul says, this is what I received. When you read the opening verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he received it. He's acknowledging that this is a creed. This is a statement of faith that is prior to him. He becomes a Christian when the church is all of 1 or 2 years old. Already the creed is in place that Jesus was crucified, was buried, and was raised on the 3rd day in keeping with the testimony of prophetic scripture. And so this is already in place when Paul becomes a Christian. And so this is what launches the church. So some kind of a later myth that Jesus is divine, a savior, or was resurrected, that would not explain how the church began at the very beginning. And so Paul is a convert, when the church is 1, maybe 2 years old, he is an enemy, and he meets the risen Christ, and he is changed, and he goes from being an enemy to an advocate. He becomes an apostle. He goes from being an opponent and a skeptic to being a very devout believer, who then gave his life for the next 30 years or so, all the way up until he's executed in Rome as a martyr, because he knew it was true. He had met the risen Christ, so he believed now what the apostles said. They had met the risen Jesus on Easter, the first Easter Sunday. Well, now Paul knew that it was so. He too had met him. And that's what he's talking about when he writes, just 20 years later, that's what he's talking about. And, Rick, there's one testimony you left out. Jesus appears to Peter, to the 12, to James, and of course to Paul himself. But Paul also says he appeared to more than 500 believers at one time. And he says most of them are still living. And so that implies, if you don't believe me, check with them.
Yes.
Most of them 20 years later are still alive and talking about it.
I can't believe this. I want another 25 minutes with you because we're out of time. This is so great. It doesn't prove that Jesus physically rose from the dead, but what it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt is that within 1 to 2 years, people were getting together in meetings, and they were gathering, and they were saying, Jesus Christ physically rose from the dead. Anyway, we're just out of time. I'm so excited to have you on Craig. We're talking about the film that you got to go see, Fragments of Truth. It's going to be in theaters April 24th, 2018. You can find information about it at fathomevents.com. That's events plural, and Fathom is Fathom. Craig, I just wish we had more time. This is awesome. Thank you for being on the show.
Very welcome.
If there's a show you've missed, you can go to my website, rickaltizer.com, and catch up. Or you can listen to my podcast in iTunes or wherever you hear your podcasts. Just search for The Rick Altizer Show. Altizer is spelled Altizer. I want to thank you for listening. Hey, would you tell a friend about this show and share the love? Be sure to check us out again next week as we discuss how we communicate the gospel through media to our culture. Let's be clear so the world can hear. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening. In Christ Jesus.